Hey, we want to thank Bill.com for being a sponsor of the Thrivecast. Our firm, Blummer CPAs, has used Bill.com as a foundational part of our tech stack for many, many years. We're a virtual firm and we work with clients virtually all over the US. And so we have to have a virtual platform like Bill.com. So thank you, Bill.com, for sponsoring the Thrivecast. Hey, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Thrivecast. This is the first episode of 2023 after all we've been through in the past few years. I wanted to kick this year off really with some really nerdy economics. So I brought a friend who really knows a lot about economics, but it's going to actually help us apply that entrepreneurship to our firms as we're leading firms. So you've seen him on the show before, Adam Davidson, the author of The Passion Economy, was a contributing writer to The New Yorker. A lot of you already know Adam and his relationship with Julie and I, covering us in his book, The Passion Economy. He was the founder of Planet Money. So a lot of you listeners know Planet Money. And that's a big part of your, that's an NPR production that's part of your podcast listening stash. So also he was a technical consultant to Adam McKay, the co-writer and director of the Academy Award-winning film, The Big Short. A lot of you knew that. And I'm pumped to call Adam my friend too. So Adam, welcome to the Thrivecast. It's good to have you. I do get to call you my friend, right?
To be here.
I get to call you my friend, right?
I'm going to say okay for now. Let's see how we feel in an hour.
Okay. So we'll go an hour. We'll see if you dump me as a friend after this. So
no, you're one of my dear friends, obviously. Oh, yes.
Adam, that is so sweet coming from you. So man, a heartfelt greeting. So well, cool. Well, I want to dive in to some economics, but it's good to see you. First of all, we haven't had you on the show.
Great to see you.
in a long. I don't know. It was probably a year or so ago. I can't even remember when you were last on the show. So, Adam, I shot you this email not long ago, and I love economics. I don't know much about it, but I love it and how it applies to the work of entrepreneurship, especially as we teach entrepreneurs and we coach them and we support them and care for them. So I shot you a politically correct email where I said, hey, I just want a right and left-leaning view of economics. What would the publications be? Wall Street Journal, New York Times. I thought those would probably be good choices. And I thought you were going to help me work through different publications because you would be the guy that would know those. And you're like, dude, your premise is all wrong. You're wrong. So that's even a wrong way to look at economics, which I didn't realize. So we had a back and forth about me probably attaching political lenses to economics, which is not appropriate. So why was that wrong to ask you that? Does it not exist?
Yeah, I mean, so there are some applications where left and right make sense in talking about economics, but they're pretty narrow and specific.
Okay.
And I think what we're seeing, which in a sense is an economic thing, is that you have politicians and you have some folks in the media who have enormous incentive to exacerbate to exacerbate differences that aren't so substantive. So I'd say some huge percentage of the economic choices made every day by the White House or by Congress, for example, or the theoretical ideas about inflation or are we heading for a recession are really narrow. And it's hard to say, oh, these people are wildly left-wing, these people are wildly right-wing. But politicians on both sides want to show, oh, we're totally different from those other guys. And then there are figures in the media, not Planet Money, but others who want to show, yeah, look, there's a big fight. You should look at the fight. It's big and it's art and it's huge. So an example I like to use is there's two examples I use, NAFTA and the corporate tax rate. So I think of when Obama was running against Mitt Romney in 2012, for a week or two, there was like a big thing. Obama and Romney have a disagreement on how much corporations should pay in tax. And it was covered, and the politicians were talking like Obama's a wild communist who just wants no corporations, and Romney's a horrible corporate overlord who wants corporations to take all the money in the world. And I did a story pointing out that Romney's proposed corporate tax rate was 22%, Obama's was 25%. This is a really narrow difference.
Very small.
By the time it got through a legislative process, it would basically be the same.
Yeah.
And they didn't really fundamentally disagree on any substantive issue about the role of corporations, our society, et cetera. By the way, tax economists, including the most left-wing tax economists, generally support 0% corporate tax rate.
Oh,
because
interesting.
It's just a really inefficient way. You don't want to taxing corporations is kind of a shadow way. I think people think, oh, they're taxing corporations. That's taxing the rich people.
Yeah.
It's taxing the workers. It's taxing the customers. Like you don't want to tax your most productive part of your economy. You want to tax, you really want an individual tax. So if your ideology is we should tax rich people, then tax rich people. So it was a case, and I think this is what I see more often than not. There's an economic way of looking at things where there isn't a lot of disagreement among economists.
Okay.
There isn't a left-wing or right-wing view.
Yeah.
And then there's a political and media system that wants to make it into some huge debate. Now, there are debates. I don't want to say there aren't. And there are ways that left-wing people and right-wing people probably do think differently. But on a day-to-day basis, it's not really that important. I mean, you take a big right-wing idea these days of the gold standard. There's a lot of kind of libertarians who want a gold standard. That's fine to want a gold standard. Most economists think it's an idiotic idea. I agree. You can want a gold standard, but we're not like a week away from getting a gold standard. It's not really a meaningful thing. If you're running a firm day to day, you could want a gold standard. You could want to visit Mars as a tourist. You could want a lot of things that aren't going to happen. I don't know that needs to be part of how you run your company.
Okay. So if you're applying economics then, or you're trying to understand economic theory as an entrepreneur, a lot of times our ideologies politically they exaggerate a lot of the economics. So we probably need to have economic conversations that are separate from political conversations. I know they have to cross one another eventually, but again, our listeners are firm owners. And they are entrepreneurs just making daily decisions and how it impacts their customer base, and they have to understand economics. They probably don't need their political views weighing into what they think about it, which is really the basis of what I was trying to do. I was trying to bucket it in a way you can't bucket it, right? Can I get economics from the right side and economics from the left? You're like, that doesn't even make sense. That's not even a thing.
Yeah, I mean, something that pops into my head is take Tim Williams and Ron Baker. I'm guessing a lot of your audience are familiar with them.
Mm-hmm.
Tim Williams, very left-wing. Ron Baker, very right-wing.
Libertarian, yeah.
Completely agree. They totally disagree on who should be president and what Congress should do and taxes and all that stuff. But neither of them has any power over that. So they can talk about it, but there's not, other than choosing who to vote for and maybe who to donate money to, there's not really much. But they completely agree with how firms should price their services.
Yeah.
And you and I think I'm more left than you are.
Yeah.
But on things that affect firms, we
believe
pretty much completely agree. It's irrelevant,
Yeah.
So we could have a fun argument over the role of government during an economic crisis or something, but until one of us becomes, the chairman of the Fed or the Treasury Secretary, it's really just two guys. We might as well talk about: do we think, that the universe is going to continue to expand forever, or will it reach a constrained point, or do we, whatever. We could argue about all sorts of things.
Yeah.
But from a firm standpoint, I think there's much, if you line up, just to use an example, accountants who believe in hourly billing and accountants who believe in value-based pricing, I'm not sure you're going to find like, oh, all the left-wing people think this,
That's
all
true.
the right-wing. But you're going to
those are economic views, really. Well, and so when I was asking you about this, I got into probably even leaning into more of an economic misunderstanding too, where I would think about F.A. Hayek, the founder of Austrian economics, who I would say is the capitalist, individualistic, pricing proponent side of economics, and Keynesian. Maynard Keynes, is the demand side, the government, pumping all the money into things, and that those two would disagree with one another. And that's actually not true. Microeconomically, I don't know, maybe it is true macroeconomically, or maybe Keynes is the one who created macroeconomics in the first place. So what is the basis of some of that? Well, maybe the history of economics, or where the heck it came from.
Sure. So, I'd be tempted to go back to Adam Smith. I always think everything starts with him. But let's fast forward a little bit to the Great Depression. So, according to the economic theory that existed in 1930, say, there was no way there could be a Great Depression, because the economic theory that existed believed that markets will get to equilibrium, which is to say that you cannot have a sustained period where people want things, bread and jobs and clothes and whatever, and people want to give it to them, but the market is not, what they say, clearing. It's not happening. And so if you look at, after Adam Smith, there's a lot of really profound economic thinking in the 19th century. Alfred Marshall's probably the biggest giant, but there's lots of other major thinkers. Nobody had in their mind that you could have a sustained depression. It just didn't. There was no theory for it. It didn't make sense. And remember, Great Britain was in serious depression all through the 20s. So by the time the U.S. is in depression, Great Britain had been in depression for 10 years already, and they had another 10 to go. So this really made no sense. And it's a time, so when you get into the 1930s, the thing that seems to make sense to a lot of people, like a lot more people than today, I think there's a view that, socialism is huge in America today. It was a really on the table with very serious people. Maybe it's communism. Maybe that's the problem. Maybe these markets that just fluctuate, they clearly don't work.
Yeah.
Everything we know about markets, all the economic research until now doesn't work. So we got to get rid of markets and really just have central control. Now, two of the giants, Hayek didn't create Austrian school. There's a bunch of other earlier thinkers, but he probably is the most well-known proponent of the Austrian school, although he left Austria and went to London. So a lot of this work happened in London.
And then Chicago too, actually, right?
He influenced Chicago. He visited Chicago. He didn't, his base was the London School of Economics.
Okay, yeah.
But so these are two giants of thought in the 1930s, confronting this same problem. The market economy that we've had, well, in some ways we've had for millennia, and in other ways we've had for 200 years or so, 250 years, has broken. So what do we do? And so there's communists and socialists who are like, oh, I know what we do. Government takes over everything. Yeah. And clearly we can't let these like crazy entrepreneurs run around doing stuff. That's not working. And businesses are terrible. We can't let them do it. So we need like good people who care about, who are going to just intervene.
Right.
So these two giants of thought, John Maynard Keynes, Friedrich Hayek, were against that. They wanted capitalism to survive. They believed in capitalism. They believed in entrepreneurship. They believed in markets. And they were trying to come up with ways to save markets. And Hayek largely did this by celebrating the price signal to really
Yeah.
zero in on this idea that coordinating a massive society. Later, one of his followers used just a simple pencil. You take a simple pencil.
It's Milton Friedman, right?
It was actually Leonard Reed, and then Milton Friedman took it from I usually have a pencil handy. I don't have one right in front of me, but
that's
Leonard Reed is the one I associate. Said, like, you have this simple pencil. There's this wood that maybe comes from Peru. There's this graphite that maybe comes from, I don't know, Pennsylvania. There's the chemicals that go into the yellow lacquer paint. There's a little metal thing. There's a rubber eraser. So many people have to make so many choices. There's someone cutting down wood. There's someone. No group of people, no matter how well-meaning, could possibly coordinate all of that. It's too complicated, and it changes all the time. There could be a landslide in Peru that knocks out 20% of the trees. There could be the opposite. Like, the weather is such that suddenly there's more trees than there ever was before.
Yeah.
But the price signal, not just the end price of the pencil, but the price all along the way, the price that the raw lumber sells for, the price that cut lumber sells for, the price of shipping. What price is doing is it's coordinating millions of people all over the world and it's doing this remarkable thing. And if that's true for a pencil, just imagine how that's true for like a Boeing 747 or whatever, know.
That's fascinating to me.
Yeah. Now, nobody disagrees with that. Keynes doesn't disagree with that. Like, very few, arguably even Karl Marx wouldn't disagree with that. I mean, he didn't write specifically about that, but I've talked to many Marxians, they call themselves now, who said, no, Karl Marx was totally into markets and the price signal. So Hayek is really trying to say, look, you don't want to go that path of like centralized control, because it's just going to break everything. We're going to have fewer pencils, we're going to have less food, et cetera.
Right.
And I'd say the Soviet Union, China, North Korea have really proven him right.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's a lot of argument over that. Keynes did a totally different thing. He structured a much more complex model in which, basically, I'm wildly oversimplifying like a very complex
because he was
set
brilliant
of ideas.
And just difficult to understand, probably.
I mean, interestingly, he was an amazing writer for the public. He wrote regular columns in the press. He would explain why there's he was a great writer when he wanted to be, but his magnum opus, his great work, a general theory. I'm suddenly forgetting what it's called. That's
a general theory of economics. No, I don't know.
No, it's I gotta find, because anyway. Well, the general theory is what we just call it the general theory. It goes on just like so. So what Keynes said, essentially, this is oversimplifying, but essentially what Keynes said is, yes, most of the time, markets and the price signal are all we need. We don't need this other stuff. But from time to time, you have the economists that came before him. He studied under Alfred Marshall. His dad was an economist, although not a very prominent one. They talked about this equilibrium. Like, you think of like a boat in a river. If you kind of shake the rowboat a little, it bounces up, but it's eventually going to hit equilibrium, and it's always going to be the same level. Yeah. And so that was the theory before. What Keynes said is, from time to time, you can have multiple equilibriums. So you can have a sustained period. So the theory of why does it go back? What's the function? Why do we hit back? Is that it's prices and supply and demand. It's like, if I want bread, maybe there's a big crisis. There's a war. There's too much gold. There's whatever. There's some big crisis, and I want bread, but you're like, oh, I'm broke. I'm a baker, but I can't buy wheat. And the guy growing wheat is like, well, I can't accept your. But eventually, the price signal the Hayekian price signal should coordinate everything. It should be like, all right, so bread is going to be cheaper now. You're going to make less money, but over time, we're going to go back up to where we were before. It's going to sort itself out.
Markets will always have equilibrium, which is the pricing focus of Hayek.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But not all the time.
They're self-correcting. Okay. They're self-correcting, and anything you do to correct them is just going to mess them up more. Like, it's just going to...
like when governments intervene, that would be a correction.
When governments intervene and say, like, a lot of times when there's hyperinflation, the government will say, okay, from now on, I spent time in Israel in the 80s when they had hyperinflation. It was literally like in the morning, bread costs, $1, and by the afternoon it costs $1.50, and tomorrow it's $2. That kind of like really rapid inflation.
Yeah.
And what governments always do is they say, from now on, bread costs $2 and it can't go up or down. But that just messes everything up, because then the people buying bread don't have enough money to buy wheat because the inflation is out of control. And so there's just no bread. So what Keynes said is that is true. Eventually, they will go back to equilibrium. So yes, eventually, but eventually might be a really long time. His famous
because they've learned there are
is,
sustained depressions now. They're seeing these, right?
It was clearly true. Yes. So, and he said, he had this famous quote, in the long run, we're all dead. Because people would be like, well, in the long run, it'll sustain. He's like, yeah, but in the long run, we're dead. So, if you're telling a 30-year-old, like, hey, don't worry, your grandkids will have a good economy, that's not the best news. So Keynes came up with a bunch of theories. Why is it? What is happening? And one of the most easy to understand, I think, is called the paradox of thrift, which is that there's a sudden economic slowdown, and you decide, oh boy, the economy's slowing down. I better start saving, because I get a grande coffee latte every morning for $6, and I'm going to make coffee at home because I can't really afford that. And that's that's the right decision for you.
Yeah.
But if everybody makes that decision, then there's just less spending. So now Starbucks is like, wow, we're really not selling any of these. We better fire a bunch of people, and we better stop buying so much foam and so much milk and coffee. And so now all the wholesalers of coffee and milk and all the dairy farmers, and they're cutting back. And that's making everyone even more nervous. So they're like, wow, all right, not only am I not buying the grande cappuccino every morning, I'm not buying new clothes this year. We're not going on vacation.
So it feeds on itself, this paradox of thrift.
It feeds on itself, the paradox of thrift, where each person is doing the right decision for them, and each company is doing the right decision for them, but the end result is a sustained recession or depression.
That hurts everybody.
That hurts everybody. Exactly. That slows the entire economy down. So what Keynes said is, there's one entity in an economy. There's firms, individuals, and government. And the one entity that can think differently about time is the government. So you are thinking about, if you spend a lot of money today that you're not sure you're going to have, you're guaranteeing a terrible future for yourself.
Yeah.
Government is the one entity that can say, what we could do is we could borrow money from the future, essentially.
Yeah.
We can issue bonds.
Yep.
Or we can use the money supply, and we can push the economy forward now. And if we do it right, we'll actually make all the money we spent now back, essentially. Like, we're gonna be the one that forces equilibrium. Now, a big idea here is something called the multiplier effect, which is that $1 of government spending has more than $1 of impact. So the government could start building roads or building bridges, or
which is what Keynes said. He would be, let's create government driven projects that would spur the economy in the midst of these depressions when the markets and the entrepreneurs aren't doing their stuff.
But they will, because this bridge is going up, and that's
right.
$10 million. And so then you're going to get a bunch of people like, oh, I'm going to work on that bridge site. I'm going to, my construction company is going to work. I'm going to hire a bunch of people. Those people start buying cafe lattes, and then Starbucks starts.
Right.
So Keynes, this whole idea that there's individual choice, there's you and me doing what we think we should be doing. There's companies doing what they think they should be doing. Everything from your corner store to Mark Zuckerberg or the Google guys or whatever. And so he came up with this idea of that's microeconomics. That's economics of people and firms. Then there's this whole other thing, which is like the economy as a whole, macroeconomics, which Hayek really doesn't have a model for or a thought about, and nobody had before. This idea that, yes, we can look at, should Jason start his own company or should he get a job? And if he starts his own company, how much should he charge for his services? And when he's negotiating with a new employee, what should the salary be? Like, there's all these micro choices.
That's microeconomics.
There's all sorts of economic theory about all that and what it works. That stuff is generally not controversial. There's some controversies, but generally you don't really see a left and right divide there. You generally see, like, you might have differences of opinion, but it's more like, should we do value-based pricing or hourly pricing? It's kind of unrelated to left-right political ideology.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Macroeconomics, generally people thought it really worked, and it really worked, especially with World War II, where you had this forced government spending. Right. And kind of to everyone's shock, because the general thought was after World War II was over, we'd just go back to the Depression.
Wow.
We then had the boom years. Yeah, that was the general consensus, because we actually had it already. We had, there's a brief period where FDR, he ramped up spending a lot. And then 1937, we had the second mini depression where the spending went down and we went right back into depression. So the thought was World War II would stimulate all this economic activity, but then once the government stopped spending, it would all collapse. But the Keynesian idea is no, because of that multiplier effect.
Right.
The government spending $1 billion actually has, say $2 billion of impact that keeps propelling the economy forward. And so after World War II, and then we get into the 1950s and this unbelievable period of economic growth, certainly in the United States.
Yeah.
Everyone is a Keynesian. Republicans are Keynesians, Democrats are Keynesians, and there's really an overconfidence of, oh, we got this. We know how to control the economy. And
we know how to use the government to control the economy at the right time.
At the right time.
Right.
And they start, so Keynes unfortunately dies in 1946 and really isn't around. I think a lot of people would agree that if he had lived longer, he would have said, and he was like 60, I want to say. He was relatively young.
Yeah.
Maybe 63, I want to say. So if he had lived another 30 years, we might be in a very different universe. Hayek lived forever. He died really old.
Yeah.
But Hayek really didn't have much to say about this stuff, and Hayek kind of went back and forth. So what happened? So Keynes was like, this is a narrow case. This is like when we're in a steady bad equilibrium.
Okay.
The government should spend. But then he said, but when we're not, when things are good, the government should be saving. They should be building up a surplus so that we can spend in those bad times.
Which we don't do that.
Which we do not. And Republicans
governments
don't do that.
Not
Democrats
do that.
Yeah.
Nobody does that, right? Nobody votes for that. I want you to think about some places in your firm where you need some help. It might be AP, AR, it may be payroll processing, it might be account reconciliations, it might be tax, whatever it is. Now I want you to think about, what if there is a way you could get the solutions you need to get that part-time help to support you in your firm? Well, our friends at Belay have been helping firm entrepreneurs like you for over a decade with U.S.-based accounting, virtual assistants, social media specialists, and website specialists also for firms all around the world. And to help you get started, Belay has a specific promotion for Thrivecast listeners. All you have to do is text the word Thrive, THRIVE, to the number 55123. That's THRIVE to the number 55123, and they'll send you that special promotion. So get the staffing help you need and get back to running your business with Belay.
Right. And I would say that's not economic, that's political.
Okay, that's when it went political.
Yeah.
Okay. So Keynes's idea was not wrong. It's that the politicians can't do it because their constituents or whatever their ideologies may be, as people vote or don't vote for them.
Or just as human beings. Like would your kids prefer it if you gave them lots of free stuff or if you didn't give them lots of free stuff?
If you said, let's save money, kids, they're like, no, I would rather not.
I'd rather spend. Yeah, I'd prefer it if you just bought me everything I told you to buy me. Actually, believe it or not, no joke. Yesterday, my son asked us to cut his allowance in half because at school he found out his allowance was more than most of his friends. And he thought it was unreasonable. I was like, you are not my son. This is a house of economics.
That is broken economics, what you have just displayed.
Yeah.
Go to your room.
My wife was thrilled, but I was like, I've never been so ashamed of you.
That is hilarious. He's a Keynesian.
He's a Keynesian. Yeah. So
he's not a Hayekian.
You're right. So this probably gets more deep than we need to go in this conversation, but basically you have 1950s, 1960s into the 70s. You have, it really is all Keynesian.
Yeah. Okay.
Richard Nixon has this famous quote, "We're all Keynesians now." And it really gets absurd. Like by the Kennedy administration, there's really this idea. You actually see this throughout. Like when the leaders of the economy start feeling super confident that we know exactly how to control the economy, you can almost guarantee a crisis is right around the corner. So, if you look at Alan Greenspan and George W. Bush and the 2000s, it's a very similar, although the opposite story. Yeah. It's the anti-Keynesians, the more conservative-oriented folks who are saying, oh, now we've really fixed it all. We know how to use monetary policy. We know how to use the Fed to make the economy hum perfectly forever. And whenever you hear that, that's when you get nervous, whether it's a left winger or right winger. Anyone who knows they've figured it out, don't believe them.
Yeah.
So we have this period of Keynesian, oh, wow, this is awesome. And if you think in terms of being a president or being a congressperson, it's awesome to be, I would call it a fake Keynesian or, a Keynesian extremist or something. It's not, Keynes himself would not be a Keynesian in that sense.
Okay.
But you would love it. Like if you could believe I can consult with firms and I have absolute power to make each firm wildly successful. Wouldn't you prefer that? That sounds great.
Yeah.
And if I'm coming to the president and I'm saying, hey, there's this toolkit, it's flawless, it's perfect, you can use it, you can spend all the money you want and still keep the economy healthy. Sign me up. I'm in. That's great. And if someone else comes along and says, actually, it's a little more complicated than that. During good times, you kind of have to be a jerk and say no a lot. And in bad times, that's when you can. It's like, I like the first guy.
Yeah. So we're understanding macro and microeconomics. Macro is that larger theoretical policy that drives markets, whereas micro is how the individual participates in how we understand the macro view of an economy.
Yes.
And I guess entrepreneurs typically will always lean, well, I don't know, but they'll need to understand more the power and effect of the micro economy they're in, which is the effect of their individual choices on what they're doing and their growth in their firm, basically.
Right. As a general rule, you can do a lot microeconomically. I mean, that's basically all you're doing all day. Like
that's right.
Every time you go to the store, or every time you hire someone, or every time you tell someone how much you're charging them, you are doing microeconomics. And so, which is good news, because microeconomics is pretty robust. It's, as a friend of mine who's a microeconomist said, microeconomics is everything we know, and macroeconomics is everything that matters. Which is to say, if an argument can be made, business people are better at microeconomics than a lot of economists. That very often there's ideas that emerge, like value-based pricing or something from business people, from entrepreneurs. It might take economists a generation or two to kind of figure it out.
Right.
Macro is, you really interact with macro when you vote, like that would be a time.
Okay.
When you make predictions like about the overall economy. So are we heading to a recession? If you do a lot of international business, like will the dollar be stronger or weaker than the euro or the yen or the pound? Okay. That's macro.
Global economic thought is going to be macro automatically, right? And voting for the president that puts the Fed chair in place, that's macro, because the Fed is controlling inflationary policy, or monetary policy rather. So, okay.
Yeah. Although they're not wild difference. Like, rather famously, Trump kept Obama's, Fed chair. Like it's not wildly different, but there are nuances, and it does matter. So, and macro is also really important as kind of the weather report of the economy. So, what's coming? The two big ideas here are the price level, which means inflation, basically, or lack of inflation. So, how much does a unit of currency buy? It is really important to know especially if I'm making long-term contracts, like if I'm going to have a 5-year contract for $500,000.
That matters.
I would like to know, what is that? What's the net present value? And that's based on expectations of inflation. And then the business cycle, which is like a recession, boom times, busts, recessions, growth, et cetera. Because that's really going to affect the conversations with customers. I mean, there are businesses that might thrive more in a recession because you're really specialized. But most, generally, I mean, by definition, spending shrinks. So there's more losers than winners in a recession. And for that predictive stuff, I think a lot of ideological modesty is really called for the firm owner. And what I think you generally see is forecasts. The people who are most right at any given moment, like the real outliers, there was a handful of people who really understood the financial crisis in 2007, 2008. It's often because they're just looking at one thing. They're not looking at the whole picture, and they're always just looking at that one thing. And so they're always predicting the same thing, and just every now and then it happens.
Right.
So I think having an open mind to a lot of different. So you might believe in the gold standard, say. Very few economists, almost no economists do. But a lot of the people who forecast the financial crisis in 2007, 2008 were big believers in the gold standard, which means they rejected the whole idea of a Federal Reserve. So they've been predicting for, decades that eventually the Fed's going to screw everything up and the whole economy is going to collapse. So they're predicting that every single morning. And then And it allowed them to actually see real things that were happening in 2007 that other people had a hard time seeing.
Yeah.
It was useful, but it's not generally applicable.
Right.
It was, I remember I had an older guy, a friend of my dad's, who took me to the horse track a few times.
Mm-hmm.
And, you read the daily form and there's all this information about each horse, how they run on wet ground, how they run on dry ground, who their mother was, who their father was, how they do in the first quarter of a race, how they do it the last quarter. There's so much. I don't know if you've ever looked at a racing form, but there's so much information. And I found it overwhelming.
Yeah.
But I learned there's this one number called the buyer speed number, which was like a hot new thing at the time, and I was like, I studied that. I was like, all right, I'm just going to use the buyer speed number. And I picked a horse. This was actually at the Kentucky Derby. I picked the winner, and none of my dad's friends had picked the winner. None of the other numbers told you that guy was going to win. But it just happened to be the buyer speed number was right. And so I turned like a $2 bet into $96, or maybe it was a $6 bet into $96. I was so happy. I was so proud. All these old guys who've been betting for decades are like, you're a genius. You're unbelievable. So, of course, all I did was use the buyer speed number from that day on and never won again.
Right.
It was just happened to be. And I think of that analogy for a lot of ideological approaches.
Right.
That just like if you have, God forbid, cancer or another health scare, your doctor might have a really strong belief in how we're going to treat it, but you're going to want to know, well, what are other people going to say? You're not going to want to get all ideological.
Right, for sure.
And that was actually something Keynes used to talk about. He said, he hoped economics would sort of become like dentists, like this kind of boring, useful profession that isn't really controversial or all that interesting.
Mm. Well, so how do we change? Okay, so now here's some things we're saying to entrepreneurs, these firm owners. We're saying, something's going on in the economy. We all know that, obviously. The Fed is continue to raise interest rates. They're trying to do something with what they call their blunt tools, right? It was what people say they do. So, and we're like, hey, entrepreneurs, you have to respond now. So microeconomically, you can't put your head in the sand and not respond to what's happening. You have to look. And so we're saying the economy, when things are happening like this, there is some sense of fear. People start pulling back, right? And we're saying from a microeconomic entrepreneurial perspective, you might want to be a little bit more conservative. And what that means is entrepreneurs take risks. They take bets on a market. They're like, if I create this new thing or this new business, I think I could carve out some additional value. And we're saying, don't do that just yet in this kind of market. Is that how we read? Is that how we use microeconomics to read a market? To help us know when to pull back or to lean into our risk to exploit that value, which is what entrepreneurs do.
Yeah. I mean, I think that if you could have pretty strong certainty about where the economy is heading, that would really impact your decision-making. The problem is there is no strong certainty.
Right.
So it's really helpful to be, I would think, it's helpful to be plugged into the conversations about forecasts and not just get obsessed with what any one forecaster or school of forecasting says.
Meaning ideology, political even ideology, is something you need to be careful with. Really, any economic ideology at all you need to be careful with, but politically, for sure.
Yeah, if you want to if you want to have your political ideology and you want to tell your friends about it, or you want to vote,
that's fine
for whatever it is. If I've known two multimillionaire communists who were super successful business people, and they rejected the very idea of millionaires existing and rejected the very idea of. And when I would ask them, they're like, "Yeah, but I live in a capitalist system, and." So I'm going to use the capitalist system that I live in. And so, and I think whether you're left wing or right wing, that makes sense. That I always use the gold standard just because it is a big idea that's is very ideological, but we're not about to have a gold standard. So you can want one, but then when you're going to the forecast, you might hate the Federal Reserve and think it's terrible, but you are going to want to understand what the Federal Reserve is doing and why they're doing it and what's likely to come of it. So it's being a little dispassionate and modest. It's
dispassionate and modest.
I don't like Keynesians or I don't like libertarians.
Right.
You're allowed to feel that way, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to them.
Right.
When they are describing.
Right. Yeah. And it doesn't mean you shouldn't make wise microeconomic choices and look around you. Like, for example, I don't think Jay Powell, the Fed chair, has said we're in a recession, but the UK has said that, right? I think they have claimed their economy is in that. Of course, they probably have reliance on Ukraine in ways that we don't, and Europe and ties to Europe. So do we look at because macroeconomics is definitely global, right? And global economics is something that's more of a macro thing than it even used to be in our lifetime, right? That globalization of an economy is a fact now. All economies are hooked in one sense or another. So do we go, the UK has claimed recession, it's coming now, we know for sure. Do we go that far out macroeconomically?
No, we don't go to we know for sure, but we can pay a lot of attention to what seem to be the drivers of that recession. Are those drivers happening here?
Yeah.
There's a big term to pay attention to is called uncoupling. So, there's a real feeling in the 90s and early 2000s that there was one global economy, and essentially, the saying was, if America sneezes, the rest of the world catches a cold. But it was like, and now we see that day to day, there's a lot of what they call uncoupling, that events in China, say, or India don't have a direct impact, but they can suddenly explode, much like, say, viral diseases might be an analogy. They can suddenly take over our whole lives. And, and we've seen that many times. In fact, a friend of mine used to be chief economist at the IMF, the International Monetary Fund. And so his biggest job was making the 3-year forecast of the global economy. And that is something worth reading. The IMF does it, World Bank does it.
Yeah.
But he said they had embedded in their model that at least once every 18 months, something crazy we can't predict is going to happen. Russia's going to invade Ukraine, or there's going to be a crazy pandemic or whatever. And which is basically saying we don't know what the hell's going to go on, but we're doing the best we can.
We're putting in our model that it will blow up and we don't know what it's going to be. Right.
We don't know why or how or
which
where
is kind of not helpful when you think about it, but it's also probably true.
Yeah, it's not that forecasts are useless. They are useful, but they're much less useful than you would want.
So be careful.
It's kind of like weather reports have gotten a lot better, but remember when we were kids, it was like they could not reliably predict the next day.
Yeah.
And now they can do a pretty good job of a week out. Like they can, and so if you're making plans, like, are we going to do that ski holiday? Like if it's saying, we think there's probably going to be a blizzard, you're going to pay attention to that.
Yeah.
I do the conceptual level, certainly when you're thinking like decades, generations, the more you understand the changing global economy, the better. And weirdly, it's almost like we can predict 20 years out better than we can predict 2 years out. And, if you don't care that much and your business is pretty local and you're going to retire in 20 years and
you kind of don't care,
your kids are on their own, then you don't care. But if you do care about that stuff, if you're not engaged in some way in what's going on in China and how China is going to grow and impact your business, or impact your customer's business if you're not directly dealing with China, that's a big question mark. India is a big question mark. complete stagnation of the Japanese economy for like 30 years now has had a very real and material impact on all of our lives. Most of us don't think about it that way.
Yeah.
But if Japan had had robust growth in the last 30 years instead of stagnation, we would be in a totally different globe. We'd probably all be richer, although we'd also be buying a lot more Japanese stuff, and a lot more American companies would be owned by Japan and stuff.
That's macro-based, work.
That's macro-based.
And macro is pretty difficult to understand. It has a lot of models associated with it and difficult, monetary policy.
And a lot of error around it. A lot of
tons of error, right? Because it's guessing.
Yeah.
Like, there's no way I would understand why Japan's stagnating economy for 30 years has affected me in the way it is. I have no clue. But right now, what would you say, as we're headed to end the podcast here, what would you say to the entrepreneur in the service-based firm industry, right? And they're all headed into tax season, right? This is kind of the bubble in the economy of a lot of firms. It's like, all the clients are jerks, or they won't pay, or I fired half of them and I doubled my price. Isn't this tax season awesome? So they all make real microeconomic choices right about now. Actually, they probably around November and December, they needed to make a lot of those choices to implement those for this tax season. So do firm owners need to be conservative through 2023? Or would you say nobody should predict what they should do microeconomically? That's something you to do. I don't know.
So one thing that you can know is just how the degree of unpredictability, the degree of volatility. And I'd say we are in a period of unusually high
volatility,
uncertainty, volatility. So you've been hearing a lot about inflation, but it's been a confusing, the day we're taping this, they just announced the CPI index went up way more than people expected. The last two times they said it was way less than people expected.
Which is one of the indicators of inflation, right? The CPI.
Of inflation. Yeah, the consumer price, how much stuff costs.
Yeah.
So we're in this weird moment where it's the nature of the economy. Like we're still like, after the financial crisis, we had this massive, we went to an economy that really was driven by the coordination of action by all the central banks in the world, the Fed, China, Europe, et cetera, UK. And we're still, it's like the patient has been in the ICU for 15 years, and we're still trying to get it into the rehab facility, get it bending that knee and doing some work. And we've never really been here. We've never had an economy like this, which on the one hand means a lot of modesty about any individual prediction. It also means a lot of uncertainty. I'd say more than usual. Is 2023 going to be a year of deep recession? Maybe. Is 2023 going to be a year of real growth? Maybe. Is 2023 going to be a year of spikes and valleys? Maybe. And that's weird. Yeah. And so that really gets to, there are times where we can make, we're pretty solid. Next year is going to be lower. We've looked at, inventories, and we've looked at, how currencies are, and we're pretty strong. We don't know if it's an actual technical recession, but the economy is definitely going to be slower in the next 12 months than the last 12 months.
It's weird now because we don't know.
Yeah. We don't know, but not knowing is important in and of itself, right? Like if you use a health metaphor, if you go to the doctor, he's like, I don't see anything wrong with you. That's good to know. If he's like, I see something really specifically wrong with you and you're in serious trouble, that's good to know.
Yeah. And
if he's like, you got a lot going on and I don't know how to read it, like that's important to know.
Yeah.
It's scary and you'd rather some certainty, but I had that with my cat this year where my cat was in the hospital and they were like, these blood tests don't make any sense. And every day we're like, well, should we put him down? Is he going to come home and be healthy? And they're like, we don't know. And it's not that that's satisfying or good, but that was true. Now, as it happened, we decided to put him down and our son asked, "Can you just wait a day? Let's see what happens." And the next day, he had a recovery, and they have no idea why. And he's now totally healthy and happy, and they literally have no idea why.
Okay, so
that's a really unsatisfying thing, but it's not, that doesn't mean that I never want to go to the vet or ask them what they think, because sometimes they do know, sometimes it's clearer, and not knowing is also important.
Okay.
Like not knowing. So what would I say? I'd say
the economy is Adam's house cat.
Be a little, keep building your firm, but be, is this the year to go $500,000 in debt on some idea that may or may not work? Probably not, unless you can really lose $500,000.
Right.
But is this the year to get completely conservative and cut back on value-based pricing and just take every client and stop the thrival type stuff? No, don't do that.
Yeah. Well, and so and then a summary to that is, which you made a point of, is this the year to do thus and such? You're like, it's important that we don't know. It's important that it's hard to predict what this year is going to be. So know that when you're making your microeconomic decisions, you are doing them in a thing that it seems that nobody can macroeconomically predict. And that is a thing. So make your own micro decision within that, the fact of not knowing, the unclarity.
Yeah. And if you want a really simple way to get a sense of that, there's 3 words. Each has 3 letters. Or no, one has 4 letters. Fed dot plot. Federal Reserve's dot plot. And they issue this report, I think it's quarterly, I want to say. And it just shows the range of predictions they're making and why. I don't know that you want to like read every word, but you can quickly, and if you start looking at it every quarter, you can get a sense.
Okay.
And it gives you just a quick kind of dashboard glance of where, because the Fed is made up of different governors and different, each of whom has their own teams of economists. There are actually some, there's 12 Fed banks. Some are very more left wing, some are more right wing, some are more this, some are more that. So it's like one quick, free, easy way to glance. So when I look at them, it's kind of all over the place.
Plot, which is
Fed.plot. And then if you Google that, it'll come up, the first result. Let's see, right now it's hovering around 2023 being between just below growth and above growth. So it's right around stagnant, with some people thinking it's going to be a recession, but a mild recession. Others thinking there'll be mild growth.
Okay.
Right now they're thinking 2024 and 2025 will have growth, but what they call sub-trend growth, meaning more like 2.5%, 2% rather than like 3%, which is what you want to see long term. Yeah. So, but is that what's going to happen? I don't know. They are much more modest on inflation. Their fears of inflation have shrunk quite a bit. And there's a huge range of views within that. And that's helpful to know. When you see those error bars shrink, you're like, oh, everyone's thinking this. When it's wide, it's like, oh man, they really don't know.
Yeah, they really don't know. Well, cool. All right. So as we're wrapping up, Adam, what microeconomic business things are you into in the last minute or two? You're always up to something.
The core idea that I get from microeconomics is how profound and deep pricing is. That pricing is not a thing, and it's certainly not an external thing, particularly in service businesses. In a way, pricing is your business. And whatever else you do, you're an accountant, you're a web designer, you make submarines, whatever you do, the pricing is when that goes from being like a hobby or whatever to a business.
Right.
And the more I learn about economics and the more I learn about being a business person, the more I think of pricing, being playful with pricing, seeing pricing as a creative exercise. understanding that price both reflects like a relationship, that if I establish a relationship with a client of deep value, I can price differently than if I don't. At the same time, pricing defines the relationship. That if I go into my business saying, like, I'm right now in the middle of kind of relaunching a series of products, and I'm really stuck between, my preference is like, I want to sell 3 of them a year for 200 grand. Mm-hmm. I think the market probably right this minute can only accept 30 to 40 grand. And so but that means my life is very different, because my life's very different with 3 clients than with 30 clients.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And can I do the 30 client at 30 grand and build, which requires more expense because I have to have a lot more support, and build towards 3 clients at 200 grand? Or what choices am I making now? Yeah. So that, I find that thrilling and exciting. I find microeconomics has a lot to teach us about that. Nice. And it also is just fun. It's kind of cool to think about. Yeah.
And it's cool to create new things. So
yeah, it's cool to create new things.
I love it. Well,
exactly.
Cool. Well, Adam, thank you for being on the Thrivecast and kicking off this year to talk about economics. I don't think we've come down on one side of the fence or not. So everybody may leave frustrated, but hey, that's the economy we're in. It's Adam's house cat. You don't know.
You don't know. And you don't want, like, if your cat is sick, the last thing you want is like, oh, I got this veterinarian. Right. He is obsessed with this one philosophy of taking care of cats. And he's 100% obsessed.
He will fix it.
Part of the time he saves cats who no one else can save, and part of the time he kills cats who aren't even that sick. And he's just obsessed. Like, that's not how you want, or like, oh, you got a leak in your pipes? I got this ideological plumber who has this really strong ideology about how plumbing should work. Like, no, you just want you want to consult a few professionals. You want to see, like, is there a consensus? If they're all like, yes, it's this thing and you got to replace this pipe, that's good to know. If they're like, we really don't know, you got some weird leak and we don't know how to fix it, that's frustrating, but that's good to know. So the more you can think of economists that way, the better.
Okay. Right. I love it. Well, Adam, thanks for being on the show. And thank you, all of you listeners, for joining us this year. We got another great show coming in February, so we'll see you soon. Take care. We're out. And on the Thrivecast and kicking off this year to talk about economics. I don't think we've come down on one side of the fence or not. So everybody may leave frustrated, but hey, that's the economy we're in. It's Adam's house cat. You don't know.
You don't know. And you don't want, like, if your cat is sick, the last thing you want is like, oh, I got this veterinarian. Right. He is obsessed with this one philosophy of taking care of cats. And he's 100% obsessed.
He will fix it.
Like, part of the time he saves cats who no one else can save, and part of the time he kills cats who aren't even that sick. And he's just obsessed. Like, that's not how you want, like, or like, oh, you got a leak in your pipes? I got this ideological plumber who has this really strong ideology about how plumbing should work. Like, no, you just want you want to consult a few professionals. You want to see, like, is there a consensus? If they're all like, yes, it's this thing and you got to replace this pipe, that's good to know. If they're like, we really don't know, you got some weird leak and we don't know how to fix it, that's frustrating, but that's good to know. So the more you can think of economists that way, the better.
Okay. Right. I love it. Well, Adam, thanks for being on the show. And thank you, all of you listeners, for joining us this year. We got another great show coming in February, so we'll see you soon. Take care. We're out.